Hey guys! Close your eyes, and let the sound of my voice carry you back through the gaslit streets, back through more than a century and a half, to an evening in Victorian England. Our destination tonight is England, during the glittering, gaslit years of Victoria's reign, a world of gilded mansions, quiet servants, and secrets kept carefully behind closed doors. But before you get too comfortable, if you enjoy slow, cozy history made for sleep, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps this little corner of the internet keep growing. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's quietly wander into the secret world of Victorian England's filthy rich. It is late in the year, somewhere in the 1870s. A thin mist has settled over London, curling low along the cobblestones, softening the glow of the gas lamps into pale golden halos. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour, slow and unhurried, as if time itself moved more gently then. If you were to walk down a quiet street in Mayfair or Belgravia tonight, you would notice something curious. Behind the tall black railings, behind the heavy front doors painted in deep greens and blacks, entire worlds are unfolding. Warm light spills from tall windows. Somewhere inside, a fire crackles in a marble hearth. Somewhere inside, silver is being polished, letters are being written by candlelight, and a household of a dozen or more people is quietly, carefully, keeping the wheels of luxury turning. This is the world we will explore tonight. Not the Victorian England of workhouses and factory smoke, though that world existed too, and we will not look away from it entirely, but the Victorian England of the filthy rich. The dukes and duchesses. The self-made industrialists with fortunes built on iron and cotton. The old aristocratic families clinging to centuries of land and title. The bankers, the merchants, the new money mingling uneasily with the old. We will walk through their grand houses, room by room. We will follow a lady through her long, structured day, and a gentleman through his. We will watch as a household of servants moves like a silent machine beneath the surface of every dinner party, every ball, every quiet cup of tea. We will see the jewels, the gowns, the food piled high on gleaming plates. And we will see, too, what lay beneath all that glittering surface, the strict rules, the private sorrows, the secrets kept carefully behind closed doors. There is no need to follow every detail. No test at the end, no need to remember names or dates. Simply let the images drift past you, like scenery outside a train window on a long, slow journey through the past. Let your body relax. Let your breathing slow. And let Victorian England, in all its golden, gilded, complicated glory, carry you gently toward sleep. We begin, as so many great fortunes did, at the beginning. The origins of Victorian wealth. To understand the filthy rich of Victorian England, we must first understand where their money came from. And the truth is, it came from many different places, some old, some very new, and the tension between them shaped an entire society. For centuries before Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, wealth in England had meant one thing above all else: land. The old aristocracy, the dukes, the earls, the barons, held vast estates that had often been in their families for generations, sometimes stretching back to the Norman conquest itself. Their money came from rents paid by tenant farmers, from timber, from coal beneath their fields, from the simple, ancient fact of owning enormous stretches of English countryside. Their titles came from the crown, their status came from bloodline, and their wealth, in theory, required no effort at all beyond existing. But the Victorian era was, above all else, an age of extraordinary change. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun to gather pace in the previous century, exploded into full force during Victoria's long reign. Steam engines roared to life in factories across the north of England. Railways stretched their iron fingers across the entire country, connecting cities that had once taken days to travel between. Coal mines deepened. Cotton mills multiplied. And with all of this new industry came an entirely new kind of wealthy person, one the old aristocracy did not quite know what to make of. These were the self-made men. Men like the textile barons of Manchester, who had started with a single mill and built empires of cloth. Men who owned shipping lines that carried goods to every corner of a British empire that, by the height of Victoria's reign, spanned nearly a quarter of the globe. Men who mined iron and coal, who built railways, who ran banks that financed all of it. Some of them had started with nothing. Some had started with a modest family business and simply had the ambition, or the luck, to grow it into something enormous. By the middle of the Victorian era, these new industrial fortunes had, in many cases, grown larger than the old landed estates. A cotton magnate from Lancashire might have more ready cash in his bank account than an earl who owned 10,000 acres but whose land brought in less each year, especially as agricultural depression began to bite in the 1870s and 1880s. Suddenly, money and status did not always align the way they once had. This created a fascinating and sometimes uncomfortable social dance. The old aristocracy still held the titles, the ancient houses, the invitations to the most exclusive gatherings. But many of them needed money, money to maintain crumbling estates, money to keep up appearances. And the new industrialists, however wealthy, often found that money alone could not buy their way into the oldest and most closed circles of society. The solution, in many cases, was marriage. A wealthy industrialist's daughter might marry into an aristocratic family, bringing with her a substantial dowry that would repair a leaking roof or pay off a mounting debt. In exchange, she would gain a title, an ancient name, an entry into a world that money alone could never fully purchase. This was, in its own quiet way, a kind of trade, new money exchanged for old status, and it happened again and again throughout the Victorian era, reshaping the very bloodlines of the English aristocracy. There were also the merchants and bankers, men whose fortunes came not from making things but from moving money and goods around the world. The great banking families, the shipping magnates who controlled trade routes to India and China, the merchants who imported tea, sugar, and spices from across the empire, all of them added their own layer to this complicated, shifting world of Victorian wealth. And beneath all of it lay the British Empire itself, vast and far-reaching, supplying raw materials, cheap goods, and enormous profits to those positioned to benefit. Cotton from India and the American South. Tea from Ceylon and China. Sugar from the Caribbean. Rubber, later in the century, from Malaya. Much of the glittering wealth we are about to explore was built, in one way or another, on this global web of trade and empire, a fact the Victorians themselves rarely paused to examine too closely, even as it quietly financed the chandeliers, the silk gowns, and the marble staircases of their grandest homes. So when we speak of the filthy rich of Victorian England, we are speaking of several different worlds colliding: old land, new industry, global trade, and ancient title, all of them mixing together to create one of the most opulent, complicated, and closely watched elite classes in English history. Let us go now and see where all that money actually lived. The country estate, a world behind iron gates. Imagine, if you will, a long gravel drive curving gently through parkland, past ancient oak trees and grazing deer, toward a house so large it seems, at first glance, more like a small village than a single home. This was the country estate, the true heart of aristocratic and industrial wealth alike, and the setting for so much of Victorian upper-class life. These estates could be almost impossibly large. Some encompass tens of thousands of acres, farmland, forests, lakes, entire villages of tenant cottages, all belonging to a single family. The house itself, often called simply the house by those who lived there, might contain 100 rooms or more. Grand entrance halls with soaring ceilings. Long galleries lined with portraits of ancestors, real and occasionally embellished. Libraries filled with leather-bound books, many of them never opened. Drawing rooms, morning rooms, smoking rooms, billiard rooms, music rooms, each with its own precise purpose, its own particular hour of the day when it was properly used. The architecture itself told a story. Many of the oldest estates had been built or rebuilt over centuries, blending Tudor foundations with Georgian additions and, very often, a heavy dose of Victorian Gothic revival, turrets, pointed arches, and dramatic stonework that consciously evoked a romanticized medieval past. The Victorians, for all their industrial modernity, had a deep fondness for looking backward, for surrounding themselves with the aesthetic trappings of knights and castles even while their fortunes were built on steam and steel. Inside, no surface was left unconsidered. Ceilings were painted or elaborately plastered. Fireplaces were carved from marble brought from Italy. Floors were laid with intricate parquet or covered in enormous, hand-knotted carpets. Curtains hung heavy and rich, often in deep reds, greens, or golds, chosen not just for beauty but to block drafts in houses that, for all their grandeur, could be surprisingly cold in winter. Every grand estate needed heat, and heat meant fire, and fire meant coal, carried, room by servants who rose before dawn to lay and light fires in dozens of hearths before the family had even opened their eyes. By the time the lady of the house descended for breakfast, her sitting room would already be warm, the fire already glowing, as though by some quiet magic she never needed to think about. The grounds themselves were as carefully designed as the interiors. Landscaped gardens, many following principles established in the previous century, created the illusion of natural, untouched countryside, rolling lawns, artfully placed clusters of trees, ornamental lakes that were, in truth, entirely man-made. Walled kitchen gardens, often hidden from the main view of the house, supplied fruit, vegetables, and flowers year-round, tended by teams of gardeners who might number a dozen or more on a truly grand estate. Stables housed not only carriage horses but often prized hunters, kept for the fox hunts that formed such an important part of country social life. Kennels held packs of hounds. Gamekeepers patrolled the woods, protecting pheasants and other game birds that would later be shot in elaborately organized hunting parties each autumn. And beyond the house and its immediate grounds lay the wider estate, tenant farms, whose rents helped fund the entire operation, and estate villages, where workers and their families lived in cottages owned by the very family they served. In many cases, the lord of the manor was not just a landlord but something closer to a local monarch, funding the village school, the church, sometimes even the doctor, in a relationship of dependency and, at least in theory, mutual obligation that had persisted, largely unchanged, for centuries. For the industrial newly rich, building or purchasing such an estate was often the ultimate goal, the final proof that new money had truly arrived. Many cotton and iron magnates spent staggering sums constructing enormous country houses in the latest architectural fashions, complete with every modern convenience money could buy, from early indoor plumbing to elaborate heating systems, determined to outshine even the oldest aristocratic families in comfort, if not always in lineage. But grand as these houses were, they did not run themselves. Behind every warm fire, every polished floor, every perfectly ironed newspaper laid beside the breakfast plate, there existed an entire invisible world of labor, a world we will explore next, as we go below stairs, into the quiet, tireless heart of every great Victorian household. Life below stairs, servants and the silent hierarchy. A great Victorian house, however beautiful, was in truth a kind of small factory of comfort, and like any factory, it required an enormous, carefully organized workforce to keep it running. A truly grand estate might employ anywhere from 20 to over 100 servants, each with a precise role, a precise rank, and a precise set of rules governing exactly how they were meant to move through the world above and below stairs. At the very top of this hidden hierarchy stood the butler, for the male staff, and the housekeeper, for the female staff. The butler oversaw the male servants, managed the wine cellar, supervised formal dining, and served as the family's most trusted senior employee, often the person who knew more of the household's secrets than anyone else alive, and who was expected, above all things, to be utterly discreet. The housekeeper, meanwhile, ran the domestic side of the house with almost military precision, managing linens, overseeing the female staff, keeping the household accounts, and ensuring that every room, at every hour, appeared effortlessly, perfectly in order. Beneath them stretched an entire chain of command. The lady's maid attended personally to the mistress of the house, dressing her, styling her hair, caring for her jewelry and gowns, and often becoming her closest confidant, privy to secrets no one else in the household would ever hear. The valet performed a similar role for the gentleman of the house, laying out his clothes, shaving him each morning, and traveling with him whenever he left the estate. Footmen, tall and often chosen partly for their handsome appearance, served at table, answered the door, carried messages, and generally provided a visible, liveried symbol of the household's wealth and status. Cooks and kitchen maids labored for hours over elaborate meals in kitchens that could reach exhausting, sweltering temperatures, especially in summer. Scullery maids performed the least glamorous work of all, scrubbing pots, hauling water, and beginning their long days often before 4 in the morning. There were housemaids who cleaned and dusted an endless procession of rooms, laundry maids who washed and pressed vast quantities of linens and clothing by hand, and stable hands who cared for the horses that carried the family everywhere they went. On the largest estates, there might also be gamekeepers, gardeners, a nursery staff dedicated entirely to the children, and even a personal hairdresser or personal secretary for particularly grand households. What is perhaps most striking, looking back now, is how deeply structured and formal this world was, not just between servants and family, but among the servants themselves. A strict hierarchy governed everything from where each servant sat at the staff dining table to who was permitted to speak first, to who ate which cuts of meat. The upper servants, like the butler and housekeeper, often had their own private sitting rooms and were addressed with considerable formality even by other staff. The lower servants, meanwhile, worked the longest hours for the lowest wages, often sleeping in cramped attic rooms, several to a bed, waking before the sun to begin fires and prepare the house before the family ever stirred. And the family themselves were often remarkably insulated from this entire operation. Bells, connected by wires running throughout the house to a board in the servants' quarters, allowed the family to summon exactly the servant they needed without ever raising their voice or leaving their seat. Back staircases and hidden corridors allowed servants to move through the house largely unseen, delivering coal, clean linens, and hot water without disturbing the family's sense that the house simply, quietly, took care of itself. Servants were expected to be, in the words of the era, seen and not heard, present enough to anticipate every need, invisible enough that their presence rarely intruded on the family's sense of privacy. A well-trained footman might stand silently in a dining room for hours, ready to refill a glass or clear a plate, without ever being acknowledged as a person with his own thoughts, his own tiredness, his own life waiting for him in a small room upstairs. For many servants, particularly those from poor rural or urban backgrounds, this work, however demanding, offered food, shelter, and a wage more reliable than what they might find elsewhere. But it came at the cost of extraordinarily long hours, little personal freedom, and a life spent almost entirely in service to a family whose comfort depended, quietly and completely, on their labor. With this invisible machinery in place, we can now follow the family themselves, beginning with the lady of the house, and the long, carefully structured day that awaited her each morning. A lady's day, mistress of the house. The day of a wealthy Victorian lady, though it might appear leisurely from the outside, was in fact governed by a rhythm as precise as any factory clock, simply measured in different units: visits, letters, dressing, and the endless, quiet management of a household. She would wake, typically, well after the servants had already been at work for hours. Her lady's maid would have already laid a fire in her room, drawn her bath, and prepared her clothing for the morning. Breakfast, for wealthier households, was often taken in a private sitting room or morning room rather than the grand dining room, sometimes alongside her husband, though in many households husband and wife kept quite separate schedules for much of the day. Mornings were often devoted to correspondence and household matters. A lady of the house was expected to write numerous letters, replying to invitations, arranging visits, and maintaining the vast social network that Victorian upper-class life depended upon. She would also typically meet with the housekeeper to discuss the day's menus, review household accounts, and address any matters requiring her attention, from a servant's illness to the ordering of new linens. Midday brought the ritual of paying calls, one of the most rigidly structured social customs of the era. A lady would dress carefully, climb into her carriage, and visit the homes of friends and acquaintances, leaving her calling card if the lady of that house was not receiving visitors, or being shown into the drawing room for a carefully timed visit, rarely lasting more than 15 or 20 minutes, if she was. These visits followed an intricate, unspoken code of etiquette, dictating exactly who called upon whom, in what order, and how quickly a call must be returned. To misstep in this world of social calls could quietly, permanently damage a family's standing. Afternoons might include a walk or a drive through a park, needlework, reading, or practicing music, all considered suitably refined occupations for a lady of leisure. Charitable work also occupied a significant place in many wealthy women's lives, particularly as the Victorian era progressed. Visiting the poor, organizing donations, or supporting a local church or hospital was seen as an appropriate and even expected use of a lady's time and resources, blending genuine goodwill with the maintenance of social reputation. As afternoon faded into evening, the pace of dressing intensified. A formal dinner, if the family was entertaining, required an entirely different gown than had been worn earlier in the day, along with fresh hair styling, jewelry appropriate to the occasion, and a change of accessories down to the gloves. It was not unusual for a wealthy Victorian lady to change clothing 3, 4, or even 5 times in a single day, each outfit precisely suited to the activity and hour, a lady's maid managing this endless procession of dressing and undressing with practiced, quiet efficiency. Evenings themselves might involve a formal dinner party, a visit to the theater or opera, a ball, or simply a quiet evening at home with the family, perhaps gathered around the piano or reading aloud. Whatever the activity, appearances mattered enormously. A lady's reputation, and by extension her family's standing, rested heavily on her ability to appear graceful, accomplished, and effortlessly composed at every hour of the day, no matter how carefully orchestrated that ease actually was behind the scenes. Beneath this elegant surface lay real constraints. Wealthy Victorian women, whatever comforts surrounded them, typically had little legal or financial independence. Property, income, and major decisions generally rested with fathers or husbands. A woman's education, however refined, was usually directed toward accomplishment rather than intellectual independence, music, drawing, languages, and needlework, rather than the more rigorous academic education available to her brothers. For all the silk and jewels, a wealthy Victorian lady's life was, in many ways, as tightly structured and constrained as the corset she wore each morning, beautiful, admired, and not entirely her own. We turn now to her husband, and to the very different world he moved through each day, a world of clubs, business, and quiet masculine ritual. A gentleman's day, business, clubs, and leisure. If a wealthy Victorian lady's day was organized around the home, her husband's day, in many cases, was organized around its opposite, the world beyond the front door. Business, politics, land management, and an entire social world of gentlemen's clubs occupied the hours of a wealthy Victorian man, hours that often kept him away from his own household for the better part of each day. For men whose wealth came from industry or trade, mornings often meant travel into the city, whether that meant a short carriage ride to an office in London or, for provincial industrialists, a walk or ride to the very mills or factories that generated their fortune. Even wealthy men who did not need to work in any practical sense often maintained a kind of business routine, meeting with solicitors, bankers, and land agents to manage investments, estate finances, and the countless legal and financial matters that came with significant wealth. For the landed aristocracy, mornings might instead be spent riding across the estate, meeting with a land agent to discuss tenant farms, rents, and improvements, or attending to duties as a local magistrate, a role many wealthy landowners held, dispensing local justice as part of their broader social responsibility. Politics, too, occupied a significant place in aristocratic and increasingly in industrial life, with many wealthy men serving as members of parliament, a role that came with considerable prestige, though relatively modest direct pay by the standards of their personal fortunes. Midday for many gentlemen meant a visit to one of London's exclusive private clubs, an entire world unto themselves. Clubs such as White's, Boodle's, or the Athenaeum offered wealthy men a space entirely separate from domestic life, a place to read newspapers, discuss politics and business, dine, gamble modestly at cards, and simply exist among other men of similar standing. Membership was carefully guarded, requiring nomination and election by existing members, and a club's reputation and exclusivity said as much about a man's status as his own personal wealth. Lunch might be taken at the club or, for those in the city, at a chophouse or private dining room, often a heartier and more masculine affair than the delicate midday meals favored in ladies' social circles. Afternoons could bring further business, a visit to Parliament if a man held political office, or simply leisure, attending a horse race, visiting a gentleman's tailor for a fitting, or engaging in one of the many sporting pursuits so central to upper-class Victorian masculine identity. Sport, in fact, occupied an enormous place in a wealthy Victorian gentleman's life and self-image. Hunting, shooting, and fishing were not merely pastimes but essential markers of status, skill, and breeding, particularly for those with a country estate at their disposal. Cricket, increasingly popular throughout the era, drew wealthy patrons both as players and spectators. Rowing, boxing as a spectator sport, and later in the century, early forms of golf and tennis, all found devoted followings among the leisured classes. Evenings brought a return to more formal domestic life, at least when a family was entertaining or attending a social event together. A gentleman would dress formally for dinner, whether at home or as a guest elsewhere, in attire every bit as codified and precise as his wife's elaborate gowns, a black tailcoat, white tie, and gleaming shoes, the uniform of upper-class Victorian evening life. Yet beneath this world of clubs, sport, and business lay real pressure. A wealthy man was expected to grow, or at minimum maintain, the family fortune, to manage an estate wisely, to uphold the family name in public life, and often to secure the family's future through advantageous marriages for his children. Financial ruin, whether through bad investments, gambling debts, or simple mismanagement, was a very real and constant fear, one that could unravel generations of carefully built status in a single, catastrophic season. With both husband and wife's daily rhythms now understood, let us turn to something that occupied a great deal of both their time, energy, and money, the elaborate art of Victorian dress. The art of dressing, fashion and adornment. Few aspects of Victorian upper-class life displayed wealth as visibly, as immediately, as clothing. A single glance at a lady's gown or a gentleman's coat could reveal, to any trained Victorian eye, a remarkably precise reading of that person's wealth, status, and taste. For women, fashion throughout the Victorian era underwent significant transformation, but certain elements remained constant, an emphasis on an extremely structured, sculpted silhouette, achieved through layers of underlying garments most modern audiences would find almost unimaginable. Beneath any visible gown lay a chemise, drawers, stockings, and crucially, a corset, tightly laced to shape the torso into the fashionable narrow-waisted silhouette of the era. Over this came layers of petticoats, sometimes stiffened, sometimes later replaced by a crinoline, a framework of steel hoops that gave skirts their enormous, bell-like volume during the mid-Victorian period, or later, a bustle, which shifted volume dramatically toward the back of the skirt. Only once all of this foundation was in place did the visible gown itself go on, often constructed from silk, velvet, or fine wool, depending on season and occasion, and frequently trimmed with lace, ribbon, embroidery, or beading that could take skilled seamstresses many hours, sometimes many days, to complete by hand. A single formal gown for a wealthy Victorian lady might represent weeks of a dressmaker's labor and a cost equivalent to a servant's entire annual wage. Color and fabric carried their own meanings. Bright, rich colors and fine silks signaled daytime informal wear or youth, while deep, formal colors, black, dark green, or burgundy, alongside heavier fabrics, marked evening and formal occasions. Morning dress followed its own elaborate, strict code, with widows expected to wear black, often for a year or more, gradually easing into gray or lavender in a carefully staged process known as half-mourning, a custom Queen Victoria herself famously extended for decades following the death of her husband, Prince Albert. Jewelry, too, followed careful rules of propriety and occasion. Diamonds, considered appropriate primarily for evening and formal wear, sparkled under candlelight and gaslight at balls and dinners. Pearls carried associations of purity and were considered suitable for daytime wear as well as evening. Elaborate tiaras, necklaces, and brooches, often family heirlooms passed down through generations, served not merely as decoration but as visible, wearable proof of a family's long-standing wealth and status. For men, fashion followed an entirely different but equally precise code. The frock coat dominated daytime formal wear for much of the era, giving way later in the century to increasingly popular morning coats and, eventually, the more relaxed lounge suit for less formal daytime occasions. Evening wear remained remarkably consistent throughout the period, a black tailcoat, white waistcoat, white bow tie, and formal trousers, an ensemble so codified it changed relatively little across decades, becoming, in essence, the ancestor of modern formal evening wear. Accessories mattered enormously for gentlemen as well. A gold pocket watch, often on an elaborate chain across the waistcoat, signaled both wealth and punctuality, a virtue much admired in Victorian society. Walking sticks, gloves, top hats for formal occasions, and carefully groomed facial hair, from the elaborate mutton chops of the mid-century to the neatly trimmed mustaches favored later, all contributed to a gentleman's carefully constructed appearance. Dressing, for both men and women of wealth, was rarely a solitary act. A lady's maid or valet assisted with virtually every stage, from lacing a corset to tying a precisely knotted cravat, and getting dressed for a formal evening event could take an hour or more, involving multiple servants working in careful coordination. This was clothing designed not for convenience or comfort, but for display, for the careful, visible communication of status that governed nearly every aspect of Victorian upper-class social life. With our elite Victorians now properly dressed, it is time to follow them into one of the grandest rituals of the entire social calendar, the London season. The season, balls, courtship, and marriage. Each spring, As Parliament reconvened and London slowly filled once more with aristocratic and wealthy families returning from their country estates, one of the most important rituals of Victorian upper-class life quietly began: the London season. Running roughly from Easter through to midsummer, the season was, on its glittering surface, a dazzling procession of balls, dinner parties, garden parties, and social gatherings. Beneath that surface, it served a far more practical purpose. It was, in essence, an elaborate, months-long marriage market, through which the sons and daughters of wealthy families were introduced to suitable partners under the careful, watchful supervision of their parents and chaperones. For a young woman, the season began with something called her presentation, or coming out. This traditionally meant being formally presented at court, dressed in an elaborate white gown, feathers arranged carefully in her hair, curtsying before the reigning monarch in a brief but enormously significant ceremony that marked her official entry into adult society. Only after this presentation was a young woman considered eligible to attend the balls, dinners, and events that made up the season proper. Balls formed the glittering centerpiece of season life. Grand townhouses were transformed for these evenings, furniture cleared away, floors polished to a mirror shine, hundreds of candles or, later in the era, gas or early electric lighting, illuminating rooms filled with flowers imported at considerable expense, even in the depths of an English winter. Orchestras played waltzes, polkas, and quadrilles, and young men and women danced under the careful supervision of mothers and chaperones seated along the edges of the room, watching every interaction with practiced, attentive eyes. A young lady's dance card, a small booklet in which she recorded which gentleman she had promised each dance to, carried significant social weight. To dance too many times with the same partner risked setting tongues wagging about a potential engagement, while an empty dance card risked the far worse fate of appearing unpopular, a quiet social catastrophe that might affect a family standing for an entire season. Beyond the ballroom, the season included a constant round of other engagements, formal dinner parties, garden parties in the long summer evenings, visits to the theater and opera, where being seen in one's box mattered nearly as much as the performance itself, and outings to fashionable events such as the Royal Ascot horse races or the Henley Royal Regatta, each carrying its own particular dress code and social significance. Courtship itself, though it might appear romantic on the surface, was conducted within an extraordinarily structured framework. Young unmarried women were rarely permitted to be alone with a young man, always accompanied by a chaperone, whether a mother, an older relative, or a trusted family friend. Conversations, letters, and even glances were carefully monitored and interpreted, both by the young people themselves and by the watchful adults around them. Marriage, for wealthy Victorian families, was rarely viewed as purely a matter of personal affection, however much genuine love might, and often did, develop between a couple. It was, fundamentally, a strategic alliance between families, one that could consolidate land, merge fortunes, elevate social status, or, as we discussed earlier, exchange the fresh capital of industrial wealth for the ancient prestige of an aristocratic title. Parents took an active, often decisive role in approving or discouraging particular matches, and a young person's own preferences, while not entirely irrelevant, typically had to align with what their family considered a suitable, advantageous union. Once a match was agreed upon, an engagement was formally announced, often accompanied by a diamond ring and a flurry of visits and letters spreading the news through the family's social circle. Weddings themselves, for the truly wealthy, could be elaborate affairs, though Victorian wedding customs were, in many respects, more modest than the lavish celebrations that would come to define later eras, often held in the morning, followed by a wedding breakfast rather than an evening reception. By the time a young couple was married, they had typically spent 1, 2, or even several seasons navigating this elaborate social ritual, a process that, for all its glamour, could be exhausting, anxiety-inducing, and, for families with several daughters to establish, extraordinarily expensive. Let us now step away from courtship and follow our Victorian elite to another central ritual of their world, the elaborate, multi-course dinner party. The dinner party, an empire on a plate. Of all the rituals that structured wealthy Victorian life, few required as much planning, staff, and expense as the formal dinner party. What might, at a modern glance, appear to be simply a meal shared among friends was, in truth, an elaborately staged performance, one that could take days of preparation and involve dozens of individual decisions, each governed by careful, unspoken rules. Invitations were sent well in advance, on fine engraved cards, and guest lists were assembled with enormous care. Seating arrangements alone could occupy a hostess's attention for hours, dictated by an intricate hierarchy of rank, title, and precedence. A duchess could not be seated below a mere baronet's wife. A newly wealthy industrialist's family might find themselves seated further from the head of the table than an impoverished but well-titled aristocrat, regardless of whose fortune was actually larger. Getting this wrong was not a minor social slip, it was the kind of mistake that could damage a hostess's reputation for months. The meal itself typically followed the style known as service à la Russe, in which courses were brought out and served to guests in careful sequence by footmen, rather than the older style of placing all dishes on the table at once. A formal Victorian dinner might include anywhere from 8 to 12, or on especially grand occasions, even more distinct courses: soup, fish, an entree, a main roast, game, a sweet course, savories, and finally dessert, each accompanied by its own carefully chosen wine, poured into its own specific glass, of which a formal table setting might include 5 or 6 different types. Behind this seemingly effortless procession lay an enormous, exhausting effort in the kitchen. The cook and kitchen staff might begin preparations days in advance for a truly formal dinner, and on the night itself, the kitchen operated with the intensity and precision of a military campaign, dishes timed to arrive at exactly the right moment, kept warm or cold as needed, plated with careful attention to visual presentation that mattered nearly as much as flavor. The dining room itself was staged with equal care. A long polished table might be laid with fine linen, gleaming silver cutlery, and elaborate centerpieces, sometimes featuring fresh flowers arranged at considerable expense, sometimes elaborate silver epergnes piled with fruit. Candles or, later in the era, gaslight or early electric lighting cast a warm, flattering glow across crystal glassware and polished silver, creating an atmosphere as carefully engineered as any theatrical set. Conversation, too, followed careful, unspoken rules. Guests were expected to speak primarily to the person seated directly beside them, alternating attention between their left and right dinner partners at appropriate intervals throughout the meal. Certain topics, politics, money, and anything considered indelicate, were generally avoided, particularly in mixed company, in favor of lighter conversation about art, travel, society, and current events of an appropriately genteel nature. At the conclusion of the meal, another distinctly Victorian custom took place. The ladies would withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen alone at the table with port, cigars, and conversation considered unsuitable for female company, whether business, politics, or simply more relaxed masculine talk. After a suitable interval, the gentlemen would eventually rejoin the ladies for coffee, music, or conversation to close out the evening. For a family that entertained frequently, and many wealthy Victorian families did, hosting formal dinners multiple times a week during the season, this entire elaborate performance represented a staggering ongoing expense. The food itself, the wine, the additional temporary staff often hired for particularly large events, and of course the wages of the permanent household staff who made it all possible. A single grand dinner party could cost more than many working Victorian families earned in an entire year, a stark reminder of just how vast the gulf had grown between the filthy rich and everyone else. Yet even amid all this careful adult ritual, another world was quietly growing within these great houses. The children of the elite, raised in nurseries and schoolrooms far removed from the glittering evenings taking place downstairs. It is to them that we turn next. Nursery and schoolroom, raising the next generation. In the great houses of Victorian England's elite, children occupied a curious, carefully separated world of their own, one that existed largely apart from the adult rhythms of dinner parties and social calls we have just explored. Tucked away in nurseries and schoolrooms, often on an upper floor of the house, wealthy Victorian children were raised primarily not by their own parents, but by a small dedicated staff hired specifically for that purpose. The earliest years of a wealthy Victorian child's life were overseen by a nurse or nanny, a servant who might herself have a small staff of nursery maids beneath her, and who bore primary responsibility for feeding, dressing, comforting, and disciplining the youngest children of the household. Parents, particularly fathers, might see their young children for a carefully limited period each day, perhaps an hour in the late afternoon, when children, freshly washed and dressed in their best clothes, would be brought down to the drawing room to be presented to their mother and, if he was home, their father, before being returned upstairs for supper and bed. This arrangement, distant as it may seem by modern standards, was considered entirely appropriate, even ideal, within Victorian upper-class culture. Close, constant parental involvement in daily childcare was viewed as somewhat unnecessary, even inappropriate, for families who could afford to delegate such responsibilities to trained staff. Affection between parents and children certainly existed, often deeply, but it was expressed within a formal, structured framework rather than through the constant daily presence many modern families would expect. As children grew older, education became a central concern, though it followed sharply different paths depending on a child's gender. Young boys from wealthy families were typically educated at home by a tutor until around the age of 7 or 8, after which many were sent away to boarding preparatory schools, and later to one of England's prestigious public schools, institutions such as Eton, Harrow, or Rugby, which despite their name were, confusingly to modern ears, private schools of considerable prestige and expense. These schools emphasized classical education, Latin and Greek, alongside mathematics, history, and, importantly, the cultivation of character, discipline, and the particular social bonds and connections that would serve these young men throughout their adult lives in business, politics, and society. Discipline could be notably strict, even harsh by modern standards, corporal punishment common, and conditions at some schools notably austere despite the wealth of the families who sent their sons there, a deliberate philosophy holding that hardship built character regardless of a family's financial comfort. Girls, by contrast, were almost universally educated at home, typically by a governess, a woman of respectable but often financially reduced background, who occupied a curious social position within the household, neither quite family nor quite servant, educated enough to teach but without the independent wealth or status of the family she served. A governess's curriculum for wealthy young women emphasized what the era termed accomplishments: music, drawing, French and sometimes Italian, needlework, deportment, and enough history, geography, and literature to make a young woman a pleasant, well-rounded conversationalist, though rarely the kind of rigorous academic education considered appropriate for her brothers. The underlying goal of a wealthy Victorian daughter's education was not intellectual achievement for its own sake, but preparation for the roles she would eventually occupy: an accomplished wife, a gracious hostess, and eventually the capable manager of her own household. Universities remained almost entirely closed to women throughout most of the Victorian era, though this began, slowly, to change toward the century's end as reformers pushed for expanded educational opportunities for women. For all children of wealthy Victorian families, regardless of gender, upbringing emphasized above all the internalization of their class's values: duty, propriety, discipline, and an unwavering awareness of one's place within a precisely ordered social hierarchy. Whatever warmth and affection existed within individual families, and it certainly did exist, children of the Victorian elite were, from their earliest years, being carefully, deliberately shaped into the next generation of ladies and gentlemen who would one day inherit the grand houses, vast fortunes, and elaborate social rituals we have been exploring throughout this evening. Let us leave the nursery now and travel to the countryside once more, for one of the most beloved rituals of aristocratic and wealthy life, the country house weekend, and the ceremonial art of the hunt. Country house weekends and the ritual of the hunt. As autumn arrived each year, bringing with it cooler air and shortening days, the great country estates of Victorian England came alive with one of the season's most elaborate and eagerly anticipated rituals, the country house party, often centered around the practice of shooting or fox hunting. A country house weekend, despite its casual-sounding name, was in fact an event requiring weeks of preparation. A hostess might invite anywhere from a handful to several dozen guests, each arriving with their own personal servants, valets, and ladies' maids traveling alongside their employers, along with an almost unbelievable quantity of luggage, since a single weekend might require multiple changes of clothing for shooting, riding, formal dinners, and casual daytime wear, each outfit precisely suited to its particular activity and hour. Guests typically arrived by private railway carriage or hired transport on a Friday or Saturday, greeted by their hosts and shown to guest rooms that had been carefully prepared, fires already lit, hot water already arranged, by the household's substantial staff. The scheduling of such a weekend followed its own familiar, comfortable rhythm: breakfast served at a leisurely hour, often with guests coming down individually rather than all at once, followed by the main event of the day, whether shooting, hunting, or simply walking the grounds, then afternoon tea, a period for rest and changing before dinner, a formal evening meal, and finally an evening of cards, music, or conversation before retiring. Shooting parties represented one of the era's most significant displays of wealth and land management. Estates maintained by gamekeepers throughout the year, protecting and even breeding pheasants specifically for the autumn shooting season, could produce truly staggering numbers of birds in a single day's shoot on the largest estates, a testament both to the land's careful management and to the family's resources in maintaining gamekeepers, dogs, and beaters, the workers who drove birds toward waiting guns, throughout the year for a handful of shooting days each season. Fox hunting, meanwhile, carried its own distinct social prestige, particularly in certain celebrated hunting counties. Riders in scarlet coats, traditionally called hunting pink, gathered on horseback with packs of hounds, following the hunt across the countryside in a ritual combining genuine sporting skill with considerable social display. To be invited to ride with a particularly prestigious hunt, or to be seen as a skilled and fearless rider, carried real social currency within aristocratic circles. For the ladies of a country house party who did not participate directly in shooting or hunting, the weekend offered its own social rhythms: walks through the grounds, needlework or letter writing in the drawing room, and crucially, the opportunity to observe, gossip about, and quietly assess the other guests, since country house parties, much like the London season, often served as venues for courtship, business connections, and political alliances, conducted in a more relaxed, informal setting than the city. Evenings brought the party back together for formal dinner, followed by whatever entertainment the house could provide: charades, card games, musical performances from guests considered accomplished enough to perform, or simply conversation extending late into the night by firelight. Some larger country house gatherings might extend across several days or even a full week, particularly around significant events in the social or sporting calendar. These weekends, for all their apparent leisure, required an enormous, largely invisible effort from an already substantial household staff, now further stretched to accommodate dozens of additional guests and their own servants. Extra food had to be prepared, additional fires lit and maintained throughout an enormous house, and an entire temporary ecosystem of hospitality created and dismantled within the span of a few days, all so that the family and their guests could enjoy what appeared, from the outside, to be an entirely effortless, relaxed weekend in the country. Having explored life at the great estate, let us now follow our Victorian elite as they venture further afield, traveling by carriage, by rail, and occasionally across the entire continent of Europe on the celebrated Grand Tour. Carriages, trains, and the Grand Tour. Travel, for wealthy Victorians, was itself an extension of the same careful display of status that governed nearly every other aspect of their lives. How one traveled, and where, said nearly as much about a family's wealth and taste as the clothes they wore or the house they inhabited. Within a city or across a country estate, the private carriage remained the primary mode of transport for much of the Victorian era, and a family's carriages, along with the horses that pulled them, represented a significant ongoing investment. Different carriages served different purposes. An elegant, open-topped landau for fashionable afternoon drives were being seen mattered as much as the journey itself, a sturdy, enclosed brougham for practical daily errands and calls, regardless of weather, and grander state carriages reserved for the most formal occasions. Coachmen and grooms, uniformed and carefully trained, managed these vehicles and the horses that powered them, another visible layer of the household staff we explored earlier. The railway, however, transformed Victorian travel more dramatically than perhaps any other single development of the era. By the mid-19th century, an extensive rail network connected nearly every corner of Britain, making journeys that once took days by carriage possible within mere hours. Wealthy families traveled first class, of course, in private compartments offering considerably more comfort, privacy, and status than the crowded, uncomfortable third-class carriages used by poorer travelers, a physical, visible segregation of the classes that extended even into the shared experience of railway travel. Wealthy families, moving between their London townhouse and country estate throughout the year, often traveled with an enormous quantity of luggage and, quite often, a significant portion of their household staff, arranged in advance by careful coordination between housekeepers at both residences to ensure everything, from the family's favorite linens to their personal servants, arrived ready to resume the household's usual comfortable rhythms with minimal disruption. Beyond Britain's shores, international travel represented one of the ultimate luxuries available to the truly wealthy. The tradition of the Grand Tour, which had originated in earlier centuries as an educational rite of passage primarily for young aristocratic men, evolved throughout the Victorian era into a broader, though still exclusively wealthy, practice of extended European travel, now increasingly including entire families rather than just young men alone. A grand tour, or an extended continental holiday inspired by that older tradition, might carry a wealthy Victorian family through France, Switzerland, Italy, and sometimes further afield to Germany, Austria, or Greece, over the course of weeks or even months. Paris offered fashion, culture, and sophisticated society. The Swiss Alps, increasingly popular as the century progressed and railways made mountain regions more accessible, offered dramatic scenery and, for the adventurous, early mountaineering. Italy, above all, held enormous appeal, its ancient ruins, Renaissance art, and celebrated cities such as Rome, Florence, and Venice, considered essential experiences for any wealthy, cultured Victorian, an opportunity to view firsthand the classical and artistic heritage that had formed the foundation of their own education. Such travel required extensive planning and considerable expense, private railway compartments and steamship cabins, accommodations at the finest hotels each city had to offer, hired local guides, and often a portion of the family's own personal servants traveling alongside them to maintain familiar comforts even far from home. Letters of credit, arranged through banks with international connections, allowed wealthy travelers to access funds across various European cities without the impracticality of carrying large sums of cash. For younger family members, such travel carried an explicitly educational purpose, exposure to art, history, language, and culture considered essential to a properly rounded upbringing, though it undoubtedly offered considerable pleasure and status alongside its improving intentions. Souvenirs collected along the way, paintings, antiquities, and decorative objects, often found their way back to England to be displayed in the very drawing rooms and galleries we explored earlier, tangible evidence of a family's sophistication, culture, and, of course, wealth. Having traveled the world, let us return home once more, to explore the drawing rooms of art, music, and conversation that formed such an essential part of wealthy Victorian cultural life. Drawing rooms of culture, art, music, and conversation. Beyond the balls, dinners, and country weekends we have already explored, wealthy Victorian life placed considerable value on culture and refinement, expressed through art, music, literature, and the particular art of accomplished conversation, all of which served both genuine appreciation and, inevitably, another opportunity for social display. Art collecting occupied a significant place in the lives of many wealthy Victorian families, particularly as fortunes grew large enough to support serious acquisition. Old master paintings, purchased from established European collections or through the increasingly active London art market, hung in the galleries and drawing rooms of great houses, while contemporary Victorian artists also found eager patrons among the newly wealthy industrial families, sometimes more eager than the older aristocracy, who occasionally viewed enthusiastic art patronage as a way to establish cultural credibility to match their financial success. Portraiture remained particularly important throughout the era, and a family portrait by a fashionable, respected artist represented both genuine artistic achievement and a lasting, visible symbol of a family's status, destined to hang for generations in the very long galleries we described in our exploration of the country estate. Sculpture, too, found a home in wealthy Victorian interiors and gardens, from classical-inspired marble figures to more contemporary Victorian works. Music filled the drawing rooms of wealthy Victorian homes on a near-daily basis. Learning to play piano, and often to sing, formed an essential part of a young woman's education, one of those accomplishments we discussed in the schoolroom chapter. An evening entertainment frequently centered around family members or guests performing for one another, an intimate, informal kind of concert that formed a regular part of domestic social life. Wealthier families might also host or attend more formal musical evenings, sometimes featuring professional musicians, or attend the opera, itself an important venue for both musical appreciation and, characteristically for the era, social display, with a family's private box serving as a highly visible symbol of status throughout the performance. Literature, too, occupied a prominent place in wealthy Victorian domestic life. Well-stocked libraries, which we glimpsed briefly in our tour of the country estate, contained not just decorative leather bindings but genuinely well-used collections, and reading aloud as a family activity, whether novels, poetry, or serialized fiction from the enormously popular periodicals of the era, formed a common evening pastime. The Victorian era, after all, produced some of English literature's most celebrated novelists, and wealthy families followed the latest serialized installments of popular fiction with considerable enthusiasm, much as modern audiences might follow a popular television series. Conversation itself was considered a genuine art form within wealthy Victorian society, and the ability to converse with wit, knowledge, and charm across a wide range of appropriate topics, art, literature, travel, current events, carried real social currency. Drawing room gatherings, whether formal evening parties or more casual afternoon visits, provided the stage for this particular skill, and a reputation as a brilliant conversationalist could enhance a person's social standing nearly as effectively as wealth or title alone. Scientific and intellectual interests, too, found a place within elite Victorian culture, particularly as the era progressed. This was, after all, the age of Darwin, of enormous advances in scientific understanding, and educated wealthy Victorians often took a genuine, engaged interest in new scientific discoveries, sometimes funding scientific expeditions or research themselves, blending genuine intellectual curiosity with the era's characteristic desire for social prestige through cultural and intellectual patronage. All of this cultural life, the art collections, the musical evenings, the well-stocked libraries, served a dual purpose entirely characteristic of wealthy Victorian society. Genuine appreciation and enjoyment existed alongside, and thoroughly intertwined with, careful social calculation, each painting, each performance, each brilliant conversation quietly reinforcing a family's claim to taste, refinement, and their rightful place among England's cultural and social elite. But beneath all this careful cultivation of taste and refinement, every great house held its share of secrets, tensions, and stories never meant to reach beyond its own walls. It is to these hidden corners that we turn next. Secrets behind closed doors. For all its polished surfaces, its careful rules of etiquette, and its glittering public performances, Victorian upper-class life concealed, behind every grand facade, a quieter world of private tension, hidden difficulty, and carefully guarded secrets, the gap between appearance and reality perhaps nowhere wider than among the very families who worked hardest to maintain that perfect appearance. Financial trouble, surprisingly, touched even some of the wealthiest Victorian families, particularly the old landed aristocracy as the era progressed. Agricultural depression in the 1870s and beyond significantly reduced the income many families drew from their rural estates, even as the enormous costs of maintaining a great house, its extensive staff, and its social obligations continued largely unchanged. Some aristocratic families, publicly maintaining every appearance of untouched wealth, privately sold land, quietly negotiated advantageous marriages for financial rather than purely romantic reasons, or discreetly reduced household staff, all while carefully preserving the public image that mattered so enormously to their social standing. Marriages themselves, arranged as they often were around strategic family considerations, did not always bring happiness, whatever affection might genuinely exist between husband and wife. Divorce, though legally possible following reforms in the mid-19th century, remained enormously difficult, expensive, and socially damaging, particularly for women, who faced far harsher social consequences than men for marital scandal. Many unhappy marriages, therefore, simply continued for decades behind closed doors, husband and wife maintaining careful public civility while privately living increasingly separate lives, sometimes taking discreet romantic consolations elsewhere, conducted with whatever care and secrecy could be managed within a household full of watchful servants. Servants themselves, despite the elaborate rules meant to render them nearly invisible, inevitably knew a great deal about the private lives of the families they served, present as they were at nearly every hour of the day and night, privy to conversations, correspondence, and private moments that families believed were entirely their own. A discreet servant, one who could be trusted absolutely never to gossip or reveal what they witnessed, was enormously valued, and the reputation of an entire household could rest, in part, on the loyalty and silence of its staff. Illegitimacy, too, represented one of the era's most carefully guarded sources of shame, and wealthy families went to considerable lengths to conceal any child born outside of marriage, whether through discreet financial arrangements, the child being raised elsewhere under a fabricated story, or, in some cases, being quietly absorbed into the household under an invented explanation of distant relation or convenient adoption. The social consequences of exposed illegitimacy could be severe and lasting, particularly for the women involved, in an era that judged female sexual conduct with a harshness rarely applied equally to men. Mental illness and disability, likewise, were frequently hidden away, family members experiencing conditions poorly understood by Victorian medicine sometimes kept largely out of public view, cared for privately at home or, in more severe cases, placed in private asylums, their existence rarely acknowledged openly within the family's public social life. The Victorian obsession with respectability and appearance left little room for public acknowledgement of anything considered a departure from an idealized, carefully maintained family image. Addiction, too, quietly touched many wealthy households, whether alcohol, increasingly available opiates, which were legal and surprisingly common throughout the era, or the significant gambling debts that could privately threaten even substantial fortunes, accumulated at exclusive clubs or through wagers on horse racing, and sometimes concealed from other family members until a genuine crisis forced difficult truths into the open. And scandal itself, when it did occasionally break through the careful walls of Victorian discretion and reach public knowledge, whether through gossip, legal proceedings, or press coverage that grew increasingly aggressive as the era progressed, could prove genuinely devastating, capable of unraveling a family's carefully built social position built up over generations in a remarkably short span of time. The fear of exposure, of public shame, of the whispered gossip that could travel with astonishing speed through Victorian high society, hung quietly over every family, however grand, shaping decisions, silences, and careful management of information in ways rarely visible from the outside. Having glimpsed these private shadows behind the glittering public surface, let us widen our view once more, to consider the other side of the estate's iron gates, the vast inequality upon which so much of this luxury quietly rested. The other side of the gate, wealth and its shadow. We have spent this evening walking through gilded rooms, following ladies and gentlemen through carefully structured days of leisure, dressing, dining, and elaborate ritual. But no honest account of Victorian England's wealthiest families can avoid, at least briefly, looking beyond the estate's iron gates, to the vastly different world that existed just beyond them, and which quietly made all that luxury possible. The same industrial revolution that generated so many of the great Victorian fortunes we have discussed also created some of the era's most severe poverty and hardship. Factory workers, including a great many children in the earlier decades of the era, labored extraordinarily long hours in often dangerous conditions for wages that provided, at best, a bare subsistence. Industrial cities grew rapidly and often in an unplanned, chaotic fashion, leading to overcrowded, unsanitary housing, poor air quality from constant coal smoke, and public health conditions that produced devastating outbreaks of disease, particularly among the urban poor. Domestic servants themselves, whose labor we explored at length earlier in this journey, typically worked extremely long days, often beginning before dawn and continuing until well after the family had retired for the night, for wages that, while providing food and shelter, offered little opportunity for savings, independence, or advancement beyond the household hierarchy itself. A scullery maid might earn, across an entire year, less than the cost of a single formal gown worn once by the lady she served. Agricultural laborers on the great estates, meanwhile, worked the land that generated so much of the aristocracy's traditional wealth, often for wages that had changed little across generations, living in tied cottages owned by the very estate they served, a relationship of dependency that offered a degree of security but very little genuine independence or opportunity to improve their circumstances. The Victorian era did produce genuine efforts at social reform, driven by reformers, journalists, and, to a real if often limited extent, some wealthy individuals themselves, who supported charitable causes, funded hospitals and schools, or advocated for improved working conditions. Charitable work, as we noted earlier, formed a genuine part of many wealthy women's lives, and some industrialists did provide model housing, schools, or other benefits for their workers, driven by a complex mixture of genuine concern and practical self-interest in maintaining a stable, healthy workforce. Yet the fundamental structure of Victorian society remained, throughout the era, extraordinarily unequal, and this inequality was, in significant measure, precisely what made the luxurious life we have spent this evening exploring possible in the first place. The low wages paid to servants, factory workers, and agricultural laborers directly subsidized the enormous households, elaborate entertainments, and lavish lifestyles of the wealthy. The global trade networks of the British Empire, built and maintained through often exploitative colonial relationships, supplied the tea, sugar, cotton, and other goods that filled Victorian drawing rooms and dinner tables. Even the very concept of a household requiring dozens of servants depended entirely on the existence of a large population with few other viable economic options beyond entering domestic service. The Victorians themselves were not entirely unaware of this inequality, and considerable Victorian literature, journalism, and public debate grappled openly with questions of poverty, labor conditions, and social responsibility throughout the era. But for the families whose world we have explored tonight, the grand estates, the elaborate balls, the careful rituals of dress and dining, this inequality typically remained comfortably distant, something acknowledged perhaps through charitable donations or occasional visits to the poor, but rarely something that disrupted the deep, largely unquestioned sense that their privileged position was simply the natural, proper order of things. Understanding both sides of this world, the glittering surface and the labor that supported it, allows us to appreciate the Victorian elite's luxurious existence not as some isolated fantasy, but as one part of a larger, deeply interconnected society, one whose echoes, in various forms, continue to shape our understanding of wealth and inequality even today. And now, as our long journey through this world of gaslight and gold draws toward its close, let us settle in for one final, quiet chapter, and allow Victorian England to fade gently into the peaceful dark. Christmas at the Great House. As winter settled over England each year, bringing early darkness and frosted window panes, the great estates prepared for one of the most beloved gatherings of the entire calendar, Christmas at the Great House, a season that, in many ways, the Victorians themselves helped shape into the holiday we recognize today. It is worth pausing here to note something remarkable. Many of the Christmas traditions still practiced across the English-speaking world trace their popularity directly back to the Victorian era. The Christmas tree, though not entirely unknown before, was popularized enormously after images circulated of the royal family gathered around a decorated tree at Windsor Castle, and wealthy families across the country soon adopted the custom with great enthusiasm, decorating trees with candles, ribbons, small gifts, and delicate ornaments in their grandest drawing rooms. The sending of Christmas cards, the singing of carols door to door, and the exchange of thoughtfully chosen gifts all rose to widespread popularity during this same period, spreading outward from wealthy households through the rest of society. For the family of a great estate, Christmas typically meant a full house, children returning from boarding school, married sons and daughters arriving with their own families, and often a gathering of extended relatives who might not see one another again until the following year. The house itself was transformed for the occasion, evergreen boughs and holly draped along staircases and mantelpieces, mistletoe hung in doorways, and the enormous kitchen staff, already stretched thin by ordinary entertaining, working at full capacity to prepare the Christmas feast. That feast itself followed its own beloved rituals. Roasted goose or, increasingly as the era progressed, turkey, formed the centerpiece of Christmas dinner, accompanied by rich gravies, stuffings, and a seemingly endless procession of vegetables and side dishes. The Christmas pudding, dense with dried fruit and spirits, was traditionally prepared weeks in advance, with family members taking turns stirring the mixture and making a private wish, and served flaming at the table, doused in warmed brandy and set alight to great delight, particularly among the youngest members of the household. Gift-giving, though considerably more modest by modern standards, formed an important part of the day, and children in particular eagerly awaited whatever small treasures had been carefully selected for them, often practical items alongside a treat or two, since the Victorian ideal still held that excessive indulgence, even at Christmas, should be tempered with sensible restraint. Beyond the family's own celebration, Christmas also carried significant charitable obligations for wealthy households, continuing the theme of noblesse oblige that ran throughout aristocratic and increasingly industrial elite culture. Many estates distributed food, coal, blankets, or small gifts to tenant families and estate workers, a gesture of seasonal generosity that reinforced, once again, the particular relationship of dependency and obligation between a great family and the community that surrounded and supported it. Servants, too, experienced their own version of Christmas celebration, typically enjoying a somewhat more relaxed atmosphere below stairs, a special meal of their own, small gifts or bonuses from the family they served, and, in many households, a tradition in which family members would briefly serve the staff a meal themselves, a rare, symbolic inversion of the usual household hierarchy, however brief and carefully contained within a single evening. As the fire crackled late into a Christmas night, with cards, games, and perhaps music filling the drawing room, the great house achieved something it perhaps rarely managed during the rest of the busy social calendar, a genuine sense of quiet, gathered warmth, family and tradition taking gentle precedence, if only for a few precious days, over the endless performance of status that governed so much of the rest of the Victorian elite year. Illness, death, and the rituals of mourning. For all their wealth, comfort, and carefully maintained appearances, Victorian families of every class remained deeply, inescapably vulnerable to illness and death, and the elaborate rituals surrounding both formed one of the era's most distinctive, and in many ways most moving, cultural practices. Victorian medicine, though advancing steadily throughout the era, remained limited by modern standards, and even the wealthiest families, with access to the finest physicians money could secure, could do little against many illnesses we would now consider entirely treatable. Infectious diseases such as typhoid, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis touched families across every level of society, and childhood mortality, though somewhat lower among wealthy families with access to better nutrition, cleaner water, and medical care than the poor, remained heartbreakingly common even in the grandest households. When death did come, particularly to a wealthy household, an elaborate, carefully choreographed sequence of mourning rituals began almost immediately. Clocks throughout the house were traditionally stopped at the moment of death. Mirrors were sometimes covered with black crape. Curtains were drawn, and the household settled into a hushed, darkened atmosphere that could last for weeks. The body itself was typically laid out at home, in an era before the widespread use of funeral homes, and family, friends, and household staff would come to pay their respects before the funeral itself. Mourning dress followed rules of extraordinary precision, particularly for women, and particularly for widows. Full mourning required wearing black, unrelieved by any color or shine, for a period that traditionally lasted a full year for a widow mourning her husband, sometimes considerably longer. Fabric itself was regulated by convention, with dull, non-reflective materials such as crepe considered appropriate for the earliest, deepest stage of mourning, gradually giving way to slightly less severe black fabrics, and eventually to a period known as half-mourning, in which soft grays, lavenders, and muted purples were considered acceptable, before a woman finally returned to the full range of ordinary Victorian fashion. Queen Victoria herself became the era's most famous, and most extreme, example of this mourning culture, wearing black for the remainder of her long life following the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, decades before her own death, and in doing so, she profoundly shaped and reinforced the broader cultural expectations around mourning that touched every wealthy household throughout the remainder of the Victorian era. Men's mourning dress, while still expected, followed considerably less demanding rules than women's, typically requiring simply a black armband, black gloves, and generally somber, formal attire for a defined period, a striking asymmetry that reflected the broader gender inequalities running throughout Victorian society we have touched upon at several points this evening. The funeral itself, for a wealthy family, could be an elaborate affair, featuring an ornate hearse drawn by black-plumed horses, professional mourners hired to walk in the procession in some cases, and a funeral monument or family mausoleum reflecting the same careful attention to status and display that governed nearly every other aspect of wealthy Victorian life. Elaborate Victorian cemetery monuments, many of which survive today, still stand as physical testament to just how seriously wealthy Victorian families approached the visible commemoration of their dead. Jewelry, too, played its part in this culture of mourning. Mourning jewelry, often containing a lock of the deceased's hair worked into an intricate design, or crafted from black materials such as jet, a fossilized coal particularly associated with mourning fashion, allowed grieving family members to carry a tangible, wearable connection to their lost loved one, a practice that strikes many modern observers as simultaneously macabre and deeply, movingly human. Beneath all this elaborate ritual and rule lay something universal, something that connected the wealthiest duchess and the poorest servant alike, genuine grief, genuine loss, and the deeply human need to mark, honor, and slowly, carefully process the death of someone loved. The Victorians simply gave this universal experience an unusually structured, visible form, one more example of their broader cultural instinct to wrap even life's most painful moments in careful, considered ritual. Old money and new money, a delicate rivalry. We touched briefly, near the beginning of this journey, on the tension between old aristocratic wealth and the new fortunes generated by industry and trade. It is worth returning to this theme now, in greater depth, for few dynamics shaped Victorian elite society quite as persistently, or quite as delicately, as the ongoing, often unspoken rivalry between old money and new. The old aristocracy, families whose land and titles often stretched back centuries, possessed something no fortune, however large, could simply purchase outright: lineage. A duke's title, an earl's ancestral home, a family crest dating to the medieval period, these carried a kind of unquestioned social authority that no amount of freshly made industrial wealth could immediately replicate. Old families often looked upon the newly wealthy industrialists, however impressive their fortunes, with a certain quiet condescension, viewing trade and manufacturing, however profitable, as somehow less refined than the traditional aristocratic relationship to land, inherited across generations without the taint of active commercial labor. Yet this old aristocratic confidence increasingly rested on shakier financial ground as the Victorian era progressed, particularly from the 1870s onward, as we noted earlier, when agricultural depression significantly reduced the income many estates generated from their traditional land holdings. Meanwhile, the new industrial and commercial fortunes, built on railways, textiles, shipping, banking, and international trade, often grew to sizes that dwarfed even the wealthiest aristocratic estates, creating an increasingly uncomfortable mismatch between traditional social status and actual financial power. The newly wealthy, for their part, often pursued social acceptance with tremendous determination and, it must be said, considerable expenditure. Building or purchasing grand country estates, as we discussed earlier, represented one common strategy, an attempt to acquire, through construction and purchase, the physical trappings of aristocratic life that could not otherwise be inherited. Sending sons to the same prestigious public schools attended by aristocratic families, seeking membership in exclusive clubs, and, perhaps most powerfully, arranging strategic marriages between wealthy industrial families and titled but cash-poor aristocratic ones, all served as pathways through which new money sought, gradually, to blend into and eventually merge with old. This marriage strategy proved particularly significant, and increasingly common as the century progressed. An aristocratic family facing declining agricultural income and a crumbling ancestral home might, with careful diplomatic negotiation, arrange a marriage between their son and heir and the daughter of a wealthy industrialist or banker, her substantial dowry providing exactly the capital needed to repair the estate, pay outstanding debts, or simply maintain the family's accustomed lifestyle for another generation. In exchange, the industrialist's daughter gained a title, an ancient name, and social entry that no amount of her father's money could otherwise have purchased for her directly. Such arrangements, while often framed in the language of genuine romantic attachment, and sometimes involving real affection alongside the practical calculation, represented, at their core, precisely the kind of strategic alliance building we discussed earlier in the context of the London season and Victorian courtship more broadly, simply operating at its most explicit, most consequential level. Social gatekeepers, meanwhile, particularly older, established society hostesses, wielded considerable informal power in determining exactly how quickly, and how fully, newly wealthy families might be absorbed into the most exclusive social circles. An invitation, or its pointed absence, from a particularly influential hostess could significantly accelerate or delay a family's social ascent, regardless of how large their bank balance had grown. By the later decades of the Victorian era, and increasingly into the Edwardian period that followed, this blending of old and new money had progressed considerably, producing a wealthy elite class that, while still deeply conscious of lineage and tradition, increasingly judged status through a more complex, layered combination of title, land, industrial fortune, and social connection, rather than through inherited aristocratic bloodline alone. The rigid old order was gradually giving way to something more fluid, though status, wealth, and the careful performance of both remained, throughout, every bit as important as they had been at the very start of Victoria's long reign. A winter evening at the Great House, a closing vignette. Let us end our exploration with one final, quiet scene, drawing together many of the threads we have followed this evening, a single winter evening at a great English country house, observed slowly, gently, as if we ourselves were simply present, unseen, within its warm, candlelit rooms. It is early evening, and outside, snow has begun to fall softly over the parkland, dusting the ancient oaks and settling silently on the long gravel drive. Inside, the house glows with warm light spilling from dozens of tall windows, each room already prepared by servants who began their work hours earlier, fires laid and lit, curtains drawn against the cold, lamps trimmed and glowing steadily. In the mistress's private sitting room, her lady's maid puts the final touches on her hair, securing a small diamond ornament, while the lady herself reviews, one final time, the evening seating arrangement for the small formal dinner she is hosting tonight, a gathering of perhaps 12 guests from neighboring estates. She rises, smooths her deep green silk gown, and makes her way toward the drawing room to receive her guests as they begin to arrive. Downstairs, in the kitchen, the cook oversees a scene of controlled, purposeful activity, the air rich with the smell of roasting game and simmering sauces, kitchen maids moving with practiced efficiency between stove and preparation table, timing each element of the evening's elaborate meal with careful precision, so that every course will arrive at exactly the right moment, exactly as hot, exactly as beautifully presented as required. In the entrance hall, a footman stands ready by the great front door, prepared to receive arriving guests, take their coats, and announce them formally as they enter the drawing room. Outside, carriages begin arriving one by one, crunching softly over gravel now lightly dusted with snow, coachmen helping guests down before turning toward the stables, where grooms wait to see to the horses. Upstairs, in the nursery, far removed from this evening's adult gathering, the children have already had their supper and are being readied for bed by their nurse, the youngest already drowsy by the fire, entirely unaware of the elegant dinner unfolding several floors below, a world they will not properly enter for years yet. The dinner itself proceeds exactly as we described earlier in our exploration of Victorian dining, course after careful course, footmen moving silently around the table, candlelight catching on crystal and silver, conversation flowing easily between neighbors seated according to careful, practiced precedents. Afterward, the ladies withdraw to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, while the gentlemen linger briefly over port, before rejoining the party for music, someone perhaps persuaded to play the piano, before the evening gradually, gently draws to its close. One by one, guests depart into the snowy night, carriages disappearing back down the long drive, their lamps' small points of light receding into darkness. The family retires. The servants, their long day finally nearing its end, complete their final tasks, banking fires, locking doors, extinguishing the last of the evening's many candles. And the great house, filled just hours before with warmth, light, music, and careful, practiced elegance, settles at last into quiet, snow-hushed stillness, waiting, as it always does, for morning, and the beginning of it all again. Closing, drifting into the Victorian night. Our long journey through the world of Victorian England's wealthiest families is nearly at its end. Let the great houses fade now, gently, into soft darkness. Picture, one final time, that quiet street in Mayfair or Belgravia, the mist still curling low along the cobblestones, the gas lamps still glowing their soft golden light. One by one, behind the tall windows of the grand houses, candles are being extinguished. The last footman is closing the heavy front door for the night. Somewhere upstairs, a lady's maid folds away an evening gown, its silk still faintly warm from the ballroom. Somewhere else, a butler makes his final quiet rounds, checking that every door is locked, every fire safely banked for the night. The grand estates, too, are settling into stillness. The long gravel drives lie empty and silent under a sky full of stars, undimmed by city gaslight. In the stables, the horses shift quietly in their stalls. In the nursery, a child sleeps soundly, unaware of the elaborate rules and rituals that will, in time, come to shape so much of their adult life. In the kitchen, banked coals glow faintly in the great iron stove, waiting for the servants who will rise again, as they always do, long before the family stirs. We have walked together through so many rooms tonight. Through drawing rooms filled with music and careful conversation. Through dining rooms glittering with crystal and silver. Through ballrooms alive with the sweep of silk gowns and the turn of a waltz. We have followed a lady through her carefully structured day, and a gentleman through his own separate world of business and clubs. We have gone below stairs, into the tireless, quiet world that made all of that glittering surface possible. We have glimpsed both the beauty and the burden of this vanished world, its luxury and its rigid rules, its warmth and its hidden sorrows. All of it, the wealth, the rituals, the secrets, the labor behind the scenes, existed once, in rooms much like the ones you may be resting in right now. And all of it, in time, faded, as all things do, into history, into memory, into the soft, quiet stories we tell each other on nights like this one. There is nothing more you need to remember. No details to hold on to, no history to recall in the morning. Simply let it all drift gently away now, like mist dissolving in the first light of dawn. Let your breathing slow. Let your body soften into stillness. Let the last candle of Victorian England flicker gently, and go out. Good night.